Our last speaker comes from a different viewpoint. Dan Walters, he's been a journalist for more than half a century, although he looks quite young, spending all but a few of those years working for California newspapers. He joined the Sacramento Union's Capitol Bureau in 1975, just as Jerry Brown began his governorship. So he's got quite a perspective on Jerry Brown. He's written more than 7,500 columns about California and its politics, and his column now appears in more than 50 California newspapers. So join me in welcoming Dan Walters.
Juan called me the cleanup hitter. Might have something to do with my tie, which has a baseball theme, I suppose. Spring training's here. All is right in the world, as far as I'm concerned. I came armed with all sorts of facts and figures, and then they all used them all. So I'm not going to bore you with repeating a lot of numbers that you've already heard, but I might have a few new numbers. But what I want to do is weave a little political narrative around all of this, about what's happened in the past, what's happening now, and what may or may not happen in the future. And particularly how the Affordable Care Act, don't you love political acronyms? ACA, Affordable Care Act, it's wonderful. But does anything make it more affordable? I don't know, but it's always wonderful to have these acronyms, these fancy titles on government programs like Covered California. You know, it would have been a lot more interesting if they'd have made it Naked California. Because that's where you are when you're in a doctor's office, usually naked, right? So maybe it should have been Naked California. But I digress. Yes, I've been around for a while. I've been around so long that I remember when Medi-Cal was first implemented in California in 1965. And I was actually looking a little bit at the history of that recently because I think it bears some relationship to what's going on in the Capitol now. There's a man named Gordon Duffy, who I happen to know quite well. He was my local assemblyman when I was the editor of a small newspaper in the San Joaquin Valley back in the 60s. And Duff was an optometrist by trade as well as an assemblyman. And he was chairman of the Assembly Health Committee in the 1960s as well. And not when Medi-Cal was adopted, but about a year later he was a member of the legislature, but he became chairman about a year later. I asked Duff once, when he was back in the 70s when I was in the Capitol and he was still there in the legislature, I said, did you really understand Medi-Cal when you voted for it? And he told me this, and actually I talked to him a few years ago just to refresh my memory about what he told me at that time. And his answer was no. He said, none of us understood what was about to happen. We've voted for it on the assurances from the Brown administration, by the way, that was the Pat Brown administration, that they understood it and would make it work. And then later we found out that they didn't understand it either. And if you know the tortured history, some of which was flashed briefly up on the screen, of Medi-Cal in California, you know that it has been a work in progress now for almost a half a century. What started out as actually in Congress as almost an afterthought to the Medicare program. And it was seen at the time in the 1960s as, well, it was a way to get some more money into the healthcare system and relieve the pressure on county hospitals, which were then providing the bulk of what was thought of at the time as charity care for the poor. And so it was enacted, and it's undergone, as the screenshot indicated, revision after revision after revision after revision since then. As it has also grown larger into now what is a $60 billion a year program covering 20% or more than 20% of all Californians. There was a period in the early days, for example, when they tried to put recipients or enrollees in primitive kinds of managed care programs. And there were great scandals, particularly in Los Angeles, of fly-by-night operators who went around door to door signing up people, and scandals worthy of imprisonment, as a matter of fact. People were it was fraud going on in a fairly massive scale. And they've been in fee-for-service and managed care and this and that and in and out, and the provider rates are a yearly dice game. You know, will they be cut this year, you know, in the final throes of the budget process every year when they need that last little bit of money to balance the budget on paper? Well, let's just whack Medicare provider rates by another 3.5% and we can get there, on paper at least. So it's been a rather tortured history over those years. And it has profoundly, I think, affected the medical care delivery system in California by becoming, for all intents and purposes, the 800-pound gorilla of medical care in California. And there's an interesting political phenomenon that has attached itself to that and to other aspects of the medical situation. When I first started covering the Capitol in the 1970s, went there just after Jerry Brown 1.0, as I like to call it. Medical politics was almost non-existent. Politics, the politics of medical care were so unimportant in the Capitol that a Democratic legislature would routinely make Republicans chairman of the Health Committee because it was unimportant, including Gordon Duffy. That's how he became chairman of the Health Committee. It was considered to be nothing, a backwater of no particular importance. It was people were, in those days anyway, consumed with things like horse racing and liquor legislation and always insurance, of course, that's always a thing. And all sorts of other matters that have since faded into obscurity. But nobody cared about medical issues. I mean, that was kind of boring stuff. But the only time they'd get excited was when, you know, the podiatrists wanted to operate on the ankle and the orthopedic surgeons didn't want to let them do it. The scope of practice issues, or when the veterinarians and the dog groomers would fight over who had the legal right to brush dogs' teeth. A real world, it really happened, believe me, it really happened. Or the psychiatrists and the psychologists would go toe-to-toe over whether the psychologists lacking medical degrees should be empowered to prescribe prescription drugs or not, and that sort of thing, those sorts of things. They would get excited about that stuff because I always involved money, which is a key to the whole thing. You know, you've heard the phrase, follow the money. Well, that's very evident in this field. As healthcare expanded, as the medical industry expanded into becoming, believe it or not, California's largest single economic activity, $200 billion a year, of which Medi-Cal is responsible for maybe a third, then politicians became interested. Big money. And the expansion of Medi-Cal, now envisioned as part of the implementation of the ACA. Has anybody used the word Obamacare in this conference yet today? No? It's banned? It's officially banned? Okay, well, I won't use it then. The implementation of the ACA has excited the Capitol once again because there's nothing that politicians like better than spending money. Particularly if it's money they do not have to extract from their own voters. It's free money. It's nirvana. And that's essentially what's going on now. As noted, not only is the exchange up and, well, I can't say it's up and running, trying to get up and running. And by the way, let me say that I'm very amused that they're going to implement some great, vast new computer program to do this. because the state hasn't implemented a successful computer program since, well, never, that's right, never, as a matter of fact. No, by golly, no, there is one. The Department of Motor Vehicles finally got their act together, and they work pretty well, actually. But just in the last year or so, we've seen a computer program after computer program abandoned, one for the court system that cost up $500 million that went nowhere. The state, just the other day, the state controller canceled a contract for the state payroll system that was going nowhere. That was the second time that had been canceled. So the idea that somehow within a very short period of time, some vast new computer system, technology system is going to be implemented and have it work, I particularly find highly amusing. Because if it happens, it'll be like the heavens have parted and sun shined on the Capitol, because it certainly hasn't happened any time lately. But anyway, I digress. I didn't mean to get into that too much. But it is one aspect of the situation. But I really want to focus on the expansion of Medi-Cal, because that's what I'm supposed to be doing, is talking about the impact on the state budget. And I think that's where some of the great unknowns lurk in the woods. As I said, politicians love to give away free money, and they see the expansion of Medi-Cal as a process of giving away free money. And they big trumpet, this is going to cost us nothing for at least 2 years, and the cost thereafter would be limited to only 10% of the thing. Well, that's not quite true, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but to the extent that currently eligible Medi-Cal people come online, the state will have to put up 50%, right? There is one thing lurking in the woods, certainly. Even though the cost for the expansion would be fairly modest, we don't know how much, nobody really knows, maybe on the outside $1 billion more a year or something like that. The expansion, if there is greater utilization under the currently eligible at a 50% ratio, that could be several $1 billion of cost at the state level. And that is a potential problem. All of this would be hitting later in this decade, just about the time Jerry Brown was winding up his second term, and just about the time that the tax increase that the voters voted for last November would be expiring. So down the line here a few years, maybe circa 2017, 2018, in that general time frame, as Jerry Brown is waving sayonara or is being wheeled out the Capitol in his wheelchair, the state could see itself kind of in a huge bind, not just because of Medi-Cal's costs, but because the taxes would be expiring at that point, and because in the interim we had committed the state to spending for Medi-Cal and for education and a variety of other things based on an assumption, basically, that this tax money was going to continue flowing forever, $6, $7, $8 billion a year forever. So that's one of the cautionary factors in all this, is that, yes, there is a potential here for several billions of dollars of additional cost on the general fund, particularly if you get a substantial implementation of the people who are currently eligible. And along with other cost factors, you could see down the line when you start looking at the long-term budgetary situation in California, you see a potential problem evolving in about 5, 6 years hence, just about the time, as I say, Jerry Brown would be ending his second term. There's a kind of and that assumes, of course, that everything goes as planned right now in terms of expenditures. The legislature doesn't get crazy about a bunch of other stuff that they would like to get crazy about if given half a chance. Therefore, the hopes that the state has achieved fiscal stability that the governor talks about all the time are basically hinge upon an assumption, a working assumption or a prayer or a hope or something, that the economy of California will have improved sufficiently by then that the expiration of those taxes will not be terribly damaging, or that by then those taxes could be reinstituted on a more permanent basis. But those two things are problematic, very problematic, and that particularly the economy. California is coming out of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and the numbers of that recession and our continuing struggling economically are pretty daunting. State lost about 1.4 million jobs in that recession. We've regained back, maybe 500,000 of those jobs so far. But even the more optimistic economists say that we will not regain our level of employment in California, pre-recession level of employment in California, for 2 or 3 more years. That's the optimist. That's the optimistic thing. And of course, in the interim, and so we're looking at maybe a 7 or 8 year hiatus here. And in the interim, our population will have grown by another couple of million people. The workforce will have grown. So even if we get back to pre-recession levels of employment, we're going to still have a fairly high level of unemployment in California. And that has a tendency, of course, to not only depress revenues, but also put greater demands on the state budget on a variety of fronts, health and welfare services particularly. So and this assumes, again, that the legislature will keep spending under control. And I think the governor's sincere about trying to do that, but there's tremendous pressures building up from all quarters, from Medi-Cal care providers to do something about the rates in Medi-Cal, even though I know they'll be raised at least temporarily under the ACA. From the advocates of other services, welfare services, for example. The welfare grants have been slashed fairly dramatically in recent years. All sorts of pressures are building up, and whether the legislature can resist those pressures or the governor will resist those pressures and maintain. And plus, there is one other factor in all this, is that the state budget that is at least balanced on paper also ignores many things that are building up, such as, for example, unfunded liabilities in retiree pensions and health care. The teachers' retirement system alone says it needs $4.5 billion more to remain solvent. CalPERS has unfunded liabilities that are also mounting. And nothing, as the legislative analyst has pointed out, nothing in the governor's current budget does anything about the $100 billion and counting liability for retiree health care that's also mounting up. So this brings new money into the healthcare system of California. It brings new money. It expands the availability of compensated medical care at least. My wife is fond of saying everybody has health care. The question is whether it's paid for or not. But its impact on an already kind of precarious fiscal situation in California could be rather significant, and it could all kind of hit at one moment in time as the tax increases expire. The governor himself is a little leery about this. He is, as mentioned, has said, yes, we will implement the expansion of Medi-Cal in California. But he says he wants some sort of guarantees from the federal government that they will not renege, which I don't think he's going to get. And there's also unsettled issues over who will actually do the expansion, whether it'll be done at the state level or at the county level. And that brings in unions and everything, and they're fighting over it too. So it's very much a work in progress. And like the original Medi-Cal that was done in 1965, it'll probably be still a work in progress a half century later. Thank you very much.